So now that all the hysteria has died down, let's talk about what the Pheonix Con almost shooter incident actually means for the future of fandom. Hi, my name's Eagle. I'm the publisher at No Earth Comics. And this is going to be my take on what's been going on with the entire Pheonix Con incident. You know, most of the things that we have to call this type of thing don't actually apply. There was no shooter. He simply had loaded guns. But let's go over the facts and what we know about them. The first fact is that the gentleman in question had 3 loaded pistols. He had a loaded shotgun. He had extra ammunition. He had knife. He had some sort of chemical spray. I've heard pepper spray and CS, which are 2 different things, but I haven't been able to track that down precisely. His stated goal was to shoot an actor and to shoot bad cops. None of this is good. He obtained entrance to the convention through an unlocked, unguarded door. He was never checked by security, and he was wandering around the convention floor with loaded weapons. Now then, a little bit about my background. For years, I did convention security for gaming conventions, science fiction conventions, comic book conventions, and fantasy conventions. This was back in the days when most of these conventions were run by volunteers and by con committees instead of by promoters. There are good aspects and bad aspects towards the volunteers being taken out and the professionals coming in and doing it. Most of the conventions are still operating on volunteers. And even though they're not run by volunteers, even though they are for-profit enterprises, they still have volunteers as the main staff that they have. They're not being paid. They're out there doing this because they love doing this. This is a passion. This is a hobby. This is a way to enjoy the convention while working. And it gives people something to do. One of the things about this is that oftentimes the security for a convention is mainly furnished by these volunteers. Yes, there will be private security, hotel security, and or off-duty or on-duty police, depending on the size and scope of the convention. But for the most part, the security is run by volunteers. This is important to keep in mind with where we're about to go with this. The first thing we need to cover is what didn't happen. What did not happen is we did not wind up with an active shooter situation. This is a good thing. This is a wonderful thing. This is a blessing. Immediately after this happened, there was a lot of consternation. There was a lot of trying to figure out how to fix it. The rest of the day went fairly normally, and then the next day, this is according to the reports that I've watched, the next day there was a brand new policy put in of no props, period. And I was about to say no prop weapons, but when people are saying no props includes Harry Potter wands and Doctor Who sonic screwdrivers, we're no longer talking weapons. This is an overreaction, but we'll go into that in a moment. The most important thing is closing the gap that this guy used, which was an unattended, unlocked door. The simple fact is, right now it's easy to tote a weapon into a convention, and I'm not talking about as part of a costume. Shirts, bags, briefcases, none of this stuff is checked at most conventions. People bring in long boxes full of comics. This is enough room to hide a shotgun. This is enough room to hide a rifle. This is not unusual. there's way too many ways to get a weapon into a convention. Penalizing cosplayers is going to be counterproductive in the long run. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. But the first thing I want to get across is that this was a preventable thing, and it would have been preventable by just a little bit tighter security. A little bit tighter security, and he would have been caught going in because his weapon wouldn't have been piece-tight, and if he had tried to get his weapons piece-tight, they would have been caught as being real weapons. That this would have been a non-issue had not that unlocked door been there. Second thing, the problem that you're going to have at a convention with a shooter, and by the way, this is inevitable. This is going to happen. Sooner or later, we are going to get an active shooter at a convention. And the reason is that most of these conventions take place in places where we have a large number of people, and most of them are not going to be armed. And if you'll notice, the pattern of active shooters in this country is attacking places where people are not armed. Attacking places where there is unlikely to be a concealed weapon permit carrier there. These happen in gun-free zones. These happen in places where even permitted firearms carriers are prohibited. So sooner or later, we're going to get an active shooter. I hate to say that, I really do, but it's an inevitable. Especially because, as we all know, fandom has its share of crazies. We always have. Most of us join a fandom because we don't fit in other places. And this is the first checkbox on an active shooter. And I'm not trying to be glib here. I'm not trying to be flippant. This is simply the truth. So, sooner or later, we're going to get one. And there are a few things that we can do as fandom, as conventions, to minimize this. But they're probably not going to get done. Instituting some sort of bag check before going into a convention floor is not a bad idea, because we're more likely to see somebody trying to tote a gun in a bag or a briefcase or a backpack than we are seeing them try to tote it in as part of a costume. Now, this guy was dressed in costume, so I'm not discounting that as a possibility. But if security is tight enough, then the costume person, the cosplayer, is not going to be able to get a weapon in because their weapons are going to get checked at the door. Sooner or later, somebody's going to start in on the metal detector stuff. And I got to tell you, that's going to drive people away. There's a lot of people that aren't going to want to do the metal detector. There's people that are going to balk at the bag check. There's people that are going to balk at there's people that's going to balk at each part of this. What we have to do is weigh the difference between freedom and security. And we have to recognize that there's problems in this country. There's serious problems in this country. The idea that going into a crowded area and shooting it up is somehow acceptable in any way, shape, or form is an indication that we have people out there that have problems that are not being addressed properly. And my main concern is how this is going to affect fandom, how this is going to affect conventions. You know, conventions are a part of my life. They've been a part of my life since I was 14 years old and I went to my first one. I have been involved with conventions for all of my life. And this is as a dealer, as a chairman, as security, as dealer's room coordinator, as Basically, if there's a position in a convention, I have done it at some point in time. I love conventions. I did cosplay before cosplay was a word. And as a dealer, I have sold replica weapons and I have sold real weapons. I'm not talking firearms, I'm talking swords, knives, the basic fantasy weapons. There's a lot of weapons culture in conventions, and the current spate of cosplay just takes that more to the forefront. And what I'm worried about is that this incident is going to lead to changes in the way that conventions work that are going to affect the enjoyment of conventions. There are many costumes there's many cosplays that the lack of props is going to severely affect the way that the cosplay works. It's going to affect the quality of the cosplay. And, a guy in a jumpsuit is just a guy in a jumpsuit. A guy with a proton pack is a Ghostbuster. But under the Pheonix Comicon style ban, he's not going to be able to wear that backpack or that proton. And this is something that I'm wanting to make clear, that we need to have a conversation about this. We need to think about this. We need to evaluate how this can best be handled. This one could have been prevented simply by having reasonable security. He never would have made it onto the convention floor if reasonable security measures had been in effect. And I'm not talking about anything beyond what they were already doing, but an unlocked, unguarded door at a convention center during a convention is an indication that security is lax. Bag checks, that's reasonable. You do that before you walk into the zoo. You do that before you do that walking into a store. It's reasonable to have your bag checked. You know this as part of carrying a bag that's large. Metal detectors, I wouldn't mind so much, but a lot of people would. I tend to set metal detectors off. I've got steel in my elbow. But it's an inconvenience that I'm used to. But where are we going to draw the line? Where are we going to take this particular conversation, and how much input are the fans going to get in it? My advice is start talking to the conventions that you go to on a regular basis now, before they start putting in policies that become entrenched and it negatively affects the way that people enjoy conventions. I realize this has been a little rambling, but I've got mixed emotions on a lot of it. And it's something that I'm torn about because I don't want anybody getting hurt. But we also have to face the fact that this is part of American life at this point, and we have to decide how much freedom we're willing to give up in return for security. Because oftentimes when you give up freedom for security, you wind up deserving neither. But please, leave your comments, leave your thoughts, and let's have a conversation about this. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll talk again.